If I ask you a question, what was the first human-made object that reached space? What would your answer be? I suppose most people would answer Sputnik 1, which was launched by the Soviet Union in October 1957. Sputnik was the first satellite launched to space, but the first object was, in fact, a German V-2 rocket developed by a young German engineer named Wernher von Braun. It was not, of course, developed for any scientific purposes. V-2 was supposed to be used against Allies during World War II. It was the first artificial object to cross the so-called Kármán line, which is a proposed boundary between the Earth's atmosphere and outer space. The Kármán line's altitude is 100 kilometers above sea level. On June 20, 1944, the V-2 rocket reached an altitude of 175 kilometers. This is the beginning of our timeline of space exploration. After Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, both the Soviet Union and the United States captured a lot of V-2 rockets. The technology was used in the future in the development of their own missiles and for space exploration. The US also managed to bring von Braun himself to the country. On October 24, 1946, the V-2 rocket was launched from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. A 35mm motion picture camera was attached to it. The rocket reached an altitude of 105 kilometers, and the camera managed to take the first pictures from space. This is how the first grainy black and white photograph of our planet looks like. What was the first animal in space? Many people might say Laika, the dog sent by the Soviet Union. But that's also not true. The first animals were sent to space from New Mexico on board another V-2 rocket on the 20th of February 1947. These were fruit flies who reached the altitude of 109 kilometers and were recovered alive afterwards. The first mammal in space was a rhesus monkey named Albert II on June 14, 1949, 2.5 years after fruit flies. The V-2 reached an altitude of 134 kilometers. Unfortunately, Albert II did not survive due to parachute failure. The space race between the US and the USSR started on July 30, 1955, and on October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first ever satellite to space. The spacecraft was called Sputnik 1 and was developed by Rocket and Space Corporation Energia, named after Soviet rocket engineer Sergei Korolyov, the Soviet counterpart of Wernher von Braun. Sputnik 1 had a round shape with 4 antennas for communication. Its mass was only 83.6 kilograms and diameter 58 centimeters, less than 2 feet. The apogee altitude, the highest altitude reached by Sputnik, was a whopping 939 kilometers. Mission duration was 22 days. In little over 3 weeks, the satellite completed 1,440 orbits around the Earth. The mission was a complete success. But the Soviets were not gonna sit around, and on November 3 the same year, just a month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2 with a Moscow Street dog Laika on board. Regretful, Laika did not return alive from the mission. The technology for deorbit was not developed yet, and the mission was suicidal for Laika. She died of overheating hours into the flight. The apogee altitude of Sputnik 2 was 1,659 kilometers, which is 700 kilometers more than Sputnik 1. However, Laika was not the first dog sent to space by the USSR. In fact, the true pioneers were Desik and Tsigan, 2 dogs sent to suborbital flight on August 15, 1951. Both of them successfully returned to Earth. The USA wasn't just gonna watch how the USSR is becoming the main space superpower. So on July 29, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or simply NASA, was founded. And just in time. On August 17, 1958, Air Force Ballistic Missile Division attempted to launch a probe to the moon, Pioneer 0, but it failed. The first successful space probe to the moon was launched by the Soviet Union. On January 2, 1959, the Soviets launched Luna 1 probe. It flew past our natural satellite on January 4. It was supposed to impact the surface of the moon but failed due to guidance problem. Nevertheless, it was a tremendous achievement in science and engineering. The following 2 missions were even more successful. Luna 2, launched on September 12, 1959, was the first spacecraft to reach the surface of the moon. It happened on September 14. Luna 3 took the first picture of the far side of the moon. It was launched on the 2-year anniversary of Sputnik 1, October 4, 1959, and took the photograph on October 7. In the following year of 1960, the Soviet Union sent famous Belka and Strelka dogs to space. They ventured to space aboard Sputnik 5 on August 19, 1960. Unlike Laika, these two successfully returned. On October 10, 1960, the USSR attempted to launch the first ever mission to another planet. Mars 1M, aka Mars 1960A, was supposed to be sent to Mars, but its launch failed. The following year, on February 4, 1961, the Soviets attempted to send a spacecraft to Venus. Tizhol is Sputnik, aka Sputnik 7, but it failed to leave the low Earth atmosphere. Venera 1 launched on February 19 the same year did reach Venus, but the connection with Earth was lost right before the flyby of Venus commenced. As a result, no data was returned and flyby was not successful, but it was the first flyby of another planet nonetheless. Technically it was. The flyby occurred on May 19. On April 12, 1961, the USSR sent the first man to space. It was Yuri Gagarin. 12th of April is the official International Day of Human Spaceflight. Gagarin spent 1 hour and 48 minutes on board Vostok 1 spacecraft. Vostok 1 orbited the Earth once and reached an altitude of 372 kilometers. Soon after, on May 5, NASA launched Mercury Redstone 7, aka Freedom 7, with the first American astronaut on board, Alan Shepard. However, he spent only 15 minutes and 28 seconds in space. The USSR was first almost everywhere: the first satellite, the first space probe to another celestial body, the first man in space. The US feared that it would lag behind in technological progress, so the country needed a specific goal to achieve. On May 25, 1961, President John Kennedy proposed the idea of crewed moon landing. Thus, the Apollo program was started. Venera 1 might have been the first spacecraft to fly past Venus, but the first successful mission occurred on December 14, 1962, and it was NASA's spacecraft Mariner 2. Meantime, the Soviets wanted to check all bars of being space pioneers, so on June 16, 1963, they sent the first woman to space. It was Valentina Tereshkova. On November 1, 1962, the Soviets sent the first spacecraft to Mars, Mars 1. However, it lost connection on March 21, 1963 due to failure of one of its antennas. However, Mars 1 was the first spacecraft to fly past Mars, but no data was returned obviously. The flyby likely occurred on June 19, just 3 days after Tereshkova became the first woman in space. In 1965 we had two important events. The Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first man to conduct a spacewalk on March 18. July 15 was the date of the first successful flyby of Mars. It was Mariner 5 sent by NASA. On February 21, 1967, Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first crewed mission with 3 astronauts on board: Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Robert Chaffee. Unfortunately, all 3 of them died during a launch pad test. The first successful crewed mission was Apollo 7 on October 11, 1968. And less than a year after, the goal of the Apollo program was achieved. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969 with 3 astronauts on board: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon, the first man on another celestial body. The second astronaut was Buzz Aldrin, while Collins was in a spacecraft orbiting the moon. During the 1960s, the USSR was actively trying to land on Venus, but failed multiple times. The first successful landing on Venus happened on December 15, 1970. It was Venera 7 spacecraft. On April 19, 1971, the Soviet Union launched the first space station, Salyut 1. It was 20 meters long and 4 meters wide. On March 3, 1972, NASA launched the first spacecraft to the outer planet, Jupiter. It was a Pioneer 10 mission. The flyby of Jupiter happened the following year, December 3. Earlier, on April 6, 1973, NASA launched Pioneer 11. It flew past Jupiter exactly 1 year after its predecessor, and on the 1st of September 1979, Pioneer 11 became the first spacecraft to fly past Saturn. While pioneers were conquering the outer planets, a lot happened. NASA's Mariner 10 became the first spacecraft to fly by past Mercury, the closest planet to the Sun. It happened on March 29, 1974, almost 5 months after the start of the mission. It was the only mission to Mercury in the 20th century. On May 30, 1975, the ESA, or the European Space Agency, was established. On July 15 the same year, the first International Space Station Apollo-Soyuz was launched. On July 20, 1976, NASA's Viking 1 conducted the first successful landing on Mars. In 1977, Voyagers, probably the most well-known pair of spacecrafts, were launched. Voyager 2 was launched earlier, on August 20, 1977. Voyager 1 was launched on September 5. Voyager 2 became the first spacecraft to fly past ice giants Uranus and Neptune. Flyby of Uranus happened on January 24, 1986. Flyby of Neptune, the farthest from the Sun planet, on August 25, 1989. On June 18, 1983, Sally Ride became the first American female astronaut and the third woman in space after Tereshkova in 1963 and Svetlana Savitskaya in 1982. On February 17, 1996, NASA and APL, aka Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, sent the Near Shoemaker space probe, and it became the first spacecraft to orbit an asteroid and to land on its surface. It orbited asteroid Eros on February 14, 2000, and landed on it a year later, February 12, 2001. On October 15, 1997, NASA and ESA launched Cassini-Huygens space mission to Saturn, which reached the gas giant in 2004, almost 7 years later. Huygens probe was the first human-made object to successfully land on another planet's moon. Huygens landed on Titan, Saturn's biggest satellite, on January 14, 2005. A year later, on January 19, 2006, NASA and APL launched a mission to Pluto. New Horizons did reach its destination 9.5 years later and flew past Pluto on July 14, 2015, over 6 billion kilometers from the Earth. Voyager 1 is currently the farthest human-made object from the Sun. Right now, the distance between Voyager 1 and our star is over 24 billion kilometers, and its velocity is over 18 kilometers per second. This is the timeline of space exploration in a nutshell. Space is amazing and will never run out of wonders to explain and mysteries to uncover.